Thank you, Georgina, for those housekeeping notes. As Georgina mentioned, I'm Mike Boland and I'm an analyst with BI Kelsey. So, welcome everyone to It's a Click to Call World: How to Reach Mobile Auto Buyers and Beyond. As the title implies, our goal today really is to examine the click to call opportunity and especially within the high value auto vertical. So, what are the opportunities and what are some of the best practices, including real life examples? And to help me do that, I would like to welcome um, my co-presenters. We have with us today John Busby, who is SVP of Marketing and Consumer Insights at Marchex. And we also have John Lotchke, who's Director of multi-screen platforms for CDK Global, and we'll be getting into their introductions and sections in just a bit, and we'll look forward to hearing their presentations. But our main goal today really is concrete rhetoric about the click-to-call opportunity and its impact on the auto vertical. And that's really just one representation of how calls are becoming a valued currency for driving leads in lots of other high-value categories. So I'll be kicking things off today with BI Kelsey data about insights to really set the stage for our speakers. And we'll hear from both Johns about additional findings and how all of this is playing out in real life. So before we get into all of that, in order to establish some context and credibility, a few words about BI Kelsey. So, for those unfamiliar, we're an independent market research and analyst firm that focuses on media and advertising. We put together insights and analysis which take form in lots of ways, including research reports and market forecasts and consulting conferences and webcasts like this. And this slide spells out a lot of the different ways that happens. And what you can also see here is a screenshot of a white paper I did last year on call monetization and call analytics. And I'm currently working on a refresh of that analysis, some of which we'll see today. So here's our agenda. We're going to go through all these topics between myself and both Johns, and the best place to start really is to talk about the factors and trends that are driving the click-to-call opportunity. So let's dive right into it. So the underlying driver for a lot of the things we'll be going over today is mobile usage and how that's driving call volume. So currently smartphone penetration in the US is about 72% and quickly growing, and the majority of searches are happening on mobile devices, according to Google. So that all leads to higher call volumes, simply because mobile usage correlates with phone calls. The smartphone bolts a search and discover device with a phone. And not only are calls resulting, but they're high value, high intent calls from transaction ready consumers. And this is especially true in high consideration and complex purchase areas such as autos. And then lastly, there's a much deeper and scientific angle that I like to go over, which is that humans have a biological imperative to communicate by voice. And that applies to most human interactions, including commerce. And despite the automation and e-commerce of the digital era, the complexities of many transactions still require voice communications and talking to another human. And that really isn't going away anytime soon, even in such a digital age. So further in support of that premise, this is a stat I usually like to give in other contexts, such as mobile shopping, but I think it equally applies here. And the magic number is 7%. So what is 7%? It is the share of US retail spending that happens online. The rest, the vast majority, all happens offline in physical stores and often in a dialogue-rich context. But more important than the 93% happening offline is that a growing portion of that is influenced through digital channels. So, for example, digital influenced offline retail constitutes about $1.7 trillion in the US, and mobile influence is over 1 trillion. But really, the main point here is that a large portion of these sources that are driving that offline commerce involve a phone call somewhere in the path to purchase. And that's just retail. When you add other sources of consumer spending like services, it can add up even more. So that really leads up to and quantifies the addressable market for call monetization. So What is call monetization? So, what do I mean when I say that? I want to stop here to define it because it's a rather broad term. I think many of you listening are familiar with it, so I'll go through this side pretty quickly. So, the most common form it takes is click to call, and its paid form in pay per call. And that includes things like call extensions, which, for those unfamiliar, is really just a fancy word for the call button you see in mobile search results. And there are several other places where we're starting to see these call buttons appear, as I'll go over in a bit. But it's not just driving calls, but also optimizing campaigns by better tracking and analyzing those calls. So, what was said on the call? How long did it last? Did a conversion result? And if so, can that be tied back to or attributed to the campaign from which that call resulted? And then going even a step further, how can that data be used to optimize campaign effectiveness on an ongoing basis? And it's also important to note that this opportunity has broad applicability in many different market segments. So we're talking different types of enterprises, everything from large brands all the way down to SMBs. So to unpack that a bit further, we have national companies that are interested in driving phone calls for large call centers. So this is prevalent in verticals like travel and telecom, such as closing a 2-year mobile service contract or cable and satellite operators signing up new users, and very much in autos, as we're discussing today. There's also the small business world. Though they don't operate on the same scale as national enterprises, their need for effective management of inbound phone leads is just as important. And that applies to mom and pops, which are the S in SMB, as we like to say, as well as the mid-market businesses, which we call the M in SMB. And those are the car dealerships of the world, or the regional mattress store chain, or others that have a larger marketing budget and the ability to really make good use of call tracking and analytics tools. And in some cases, you actually have a combination of all of the above when you have auto manufacturers and their affiliated dealer networks and the co-op dollars that they provide for localized marketing. So the main point here is that the opportunity we're discussing today has a large addressable market and really broad applicability to many market segments and buyers. So, speaking of broad applicability, it's also taking over many different formats and mobile channels, and that's happening as consumers' points of engagement on mobile are themselves rapidly expanding. So, for example, click to call is often thought of in a search context, but it's not just search. The opportunity really lives in many places, and that basically includes the growing number of places phone numbers are showing up in mobile channels, as I alluded to earlier. And that includes display ads, which are getting increasingly dynamic with actionable buttons like call links. It can include landing pages such as your mobile website or directory apps like YP and Yelp and Foursquare and others. And it also includes social apps, which is actually the fastest growing category that's driving calls to businesses. And I want to spend a little bit of time drilling down on that. So we're seeing lots of ways that social media is trying to monetize natively. And that increasingly includes in-feed ad units, like Facebook newsfeed ads, for example. And that's really nothing new, but what is new is that these native ad units are increasingly getting actionable with buttons to engage with a business. And we've seen a lot of activity around embedding buy buttons in mobile interfaces to drive m-commerce. And Google and Facebook just launched buy buttons in the last week alone. We've also seen Pinterest and Instagram in the last couple months embed these buy buttons in their native in-feed ad units. But the next step and the larger play for these networks will be a call button for that, again, much larger offline commerce opportunity. And we're already seeing traction there. So Google's been doing this for a while with call extensions in mobile search results. Twitter has experimented with click-to-call buttons that give advertisers tools to let their customers call them directly from within promoted tweets. And Facebook recently integrated call buttons within newsfeed ads as part of its local awareness ads program. And that's what you see here on this screen. And we're going to see a lot more of this type of thing in the coming weeks and months. So that leads to my last topic before I hand it over to John, which is to discuss some of the call volume and conversion data we're seeing as a result of all the trends I just outlined. So let's first dive into our fresh call volume forecast data. So previously we measured call volume resulting from mobile search, but because this is expanding to so many other mobile content formats, it really compelled us to segment this out a bit more. So the top line finding is that calls driven to businesses from all mobile content formats total about 93 billion this year, growing to about 160 billion by 2019. And that includes both mobile app and mobile web. But more importantly, how does that segment between different formats? So search is the clear winner in terms of call volume, and that's a function of its intent-based nature, which tends to drive lots of calls. And also the intuitive handoff from search to call that's being driven by lots of tools like call extensions and search results. But another notable finding here, again, is that social is the smallest but fastest growing format from which calls will be generated, and that's simply due to all of the things I went over on the previous slide. But another thing to note here is that social is taking a bite out of traditional display, which is showing flat growth. But lastly, landing pages are also interesting because all of the work that Google's doing to compel the world to optimize web pages. And that overall effort is going to result in a more cleaned up mobile web, including optimized landing pages where people can find things faster, including calls to action like phone numbers and call buttons. But this also includes apps like listings and profiles in places like Yelp. And it's also important to note that it's not just quantity but quality. These calls that are happening are doing so at impactful parts of the purchase cycle. So 61% of Google survey respondents reported that it's very important to be able to call a business when they're in a purchase phase of the buying process. And this is powerful because it's when buyers are closest to a transaction, and therefore the opportunity to influence them through a phone call is high. And that's why we see some of the favorable call conversion metrics that John's going to unpack in just a bit. And then further in support of that high value of incoming phone leads, Google reports the median prices in different verticals where phone calls tend to happen. And as you can see, we're talking about large considered purchases. It obviously varies by vertical because there are different price points in these product categories. But as you can see, it can get into the 4-digit range for things like autos. And that $11.95 may seem less than the cost of a car, but we're also talking about parts and service, which is a big revenue driver, as John's going to go over in a bit. But the bottom line here is really that this is all supportive of the case that phone leads themselves can likewise carry lots of value in these high consideration categories because such high ticket items are being considered. So it really compels the tools we're going to talk about today to drive and track these calls in intelligent ways. So all of that data hopefully characterizes the call monetization opportunity in terms of the what and the why. What is it and why should you be paying attention? But equally important is the how, and that's where Marchex is going to play an important role today in extending and illustrating many of the points I made with a view of what they're seeing as a leading kind of practitioner of click-to-call and call analytics. So thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to any questions at the end. And at this point, I'll turn it over to you, John.
Thanks, Mike, and great to speak with everyone today. My name is John Busby. I run the consumer insights and marketing teams at Marchex. I guess I just want to say to start with, it's really fun to be a marketer these days because so much is changing. And I love, Mike, what you presented at the outset about all the ways that the consumer path to purchase is changing, and it really provides a set of challenges, but also opportunities for marketers of auto dealers, auto repair shops, auto parts, etc., to capture consumers in new ways. This slide is our About Marchex slide. What we do is we connect online behavior with offline real-world experiences for the auto industry, and really the bridge between the online and the offline world is the phone call. Our platform, Marchex Call Analytics, measures phone calls from all the different types of advertising campaigns that Mike was highlighting in the earlier section, and then our ad network, Marchex Call Marketplace, is a pay-per-call performance product that delivers high-quality inbound phone calls from hundreds of publishers. So let's move on. I think what I'd like to do is take the data that Mike was going through and distill it a bit for the auto industry. And then what I'll do is I'll share some of the data that comes directly from our platform, and then hand it off to the expert, John, the real marketer in the room from CDK Global, who will show you how he's making it all work for his company. But let's go to the next slide. We all know that this is happening. Searches are happening in tons of different ways. The mobile web page looks a lot different than the landing page on a PC or the PC page because the call button and the maps are so prominent. Heading to the next page, it's very natural for a marketer to ask, what's the most common response to a mobile search? Because understanding the outcomes that a consumer has really tells you where you need to focus on the consumer journey. And so I ask a bunch of questions here. You know, is visiting a website or filling out a form? Is an online auto purchase or visiting a dealer? Is that the most popular next step for a consumer? It's actually none of these. And the next slide, you can probably guess where this is going. But this is my daughter negotiating our latest auto purchase. And it also is my way of saying that that a phone call is the most natural response to a mobile search. You're reaching out and establishing that human connection with a dealer. Let me try to quantify this in the next few slides. So the next slide just shows how important that consumers see a search engine. So pretty much everyone uses a search engine to help them research and select a car. More than half of consumers see search engines as actually the most important source for vehicle research. And the next slide shows how much this is migrating to mobile. The data here, as you can see, is from the end of 2012 and 2013. It comes from Google. To my eyes, they haven't updated this since then, but I think it's still relevant to show what percentage of the queries are becoming mobile queries and mobile searches. Mike's data point from earlier in the presentation was about 51% of all searches. I suspect you're looking at the trend from this slide, it's way above that now for autos. But I guess the key thing for a marketer is asking ourselves, okay, how does this translate into leads that I can work at the auto dealer? So the next slide seeks to quantify this. And this data comes from Automotive News. Sorry, it's not cited on the slide here. But from mobile, leads come in over forms on a 3-to-1 basis. So really, if you're not understanding or not capturing the inbound phone calls from mobile marketing or mobile search, you're missing a huge piece of the puzzle. So that's the market data. Let me talk a little bit about some of the data that our platform surfaces to help quantify for marketers what's really going on with these things and how marketers can take action to reallocate budgets, improve media efficiency, acquire more leads, that sort of thing. So let's hit the next slide, please. And now let's get one more. I want to provide some context into where the data comes from. So our clients, anytime they want a phone call measured, they use a Marchex call tracking number and place it on a social, search ad, web page, etc. And then our platform, using Marchex Call DNA, is technology that automatically scores, classifies, and visually maps phone calls to tell a marketer not just how many calls per source or how long those calls were, but one layer deeper to truly understanding those. And that's where the next set of data comes from. So off to the next slide. This is a view of approximately 50,000 phone calls consumers make to auto dealers from mobile and digital campaigns across all types of dealers. And this is just designed to show the types of phone calls that occur, and we'll dive into each one in a moment. Nearly 3/4 of calls are product or service calls. 16% of them actually go unanswered. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then 13% are non-product or service calls. And just to let you know what those are, they're business-to-business calls, they're solicitor calls, job inquiries, etc. So you're always going to get some of those, no matter what your advertising program is. The next slide, I think, goes into product or service calls. Let's take a look. Yep. So what this does is this shows a distribution of the types of product or service calls that occur incoming to dealers. And more than half of these are service calls, and the next biggest chunk are parts calls. I don't have the data in front of me, but the parts and service sales at auto dealers are a $1 billion industry. And so these inbound calls can definitely be looked at as a revenue source for these types of purchases. But also sort of the huge purchases, used cars and new car purchases, those still happen in very meaningful volumes. By our count, about 1 in 8, 1 in every 7 phone calls is about that, and a significant portion of those calls actually turn into on-site appointments, and that's what the next slide seeks to get into. So what this does is it seeks to show the different types of call outcomes for calls to auto dealers. So 27% of them lead to a sale or appointment. Really, the majority of those are appointments, either for something like a test drive, or to see someone at the dealer, or a parts and service appointment. And then you have a bunch of other types of calls. I'll work clockwise. Follow-up's a pretty big chunk. People calling, maybe it's to pick up their car, but maybe it's to follow up on a other question. You have some calls of people leaving messages or hours and directions, and you have a whole other set of calls that don't end in one of these outcomes, but are generally detailed product or service questions. And there's a little bit of a leaky funnel here for many locations, which I'll talk about in a few slides. Next slide, please. So I'd like to spend some time talking about the 16% of unanswered phone calls, because if there's sort of one thing that auto dealers can do on the operational side to become more effective, I think it's handling the volume of inbound calls that are occurring. You can see that 88% of these types of calls are a hang-up in the phone tree, meaning thanks for calling such and such dealer, press 1 for sales, press 2 for service, nobody's picking up the phone, or simply someone reaches a voicemail, maybe at an individual sales rep's desk, and decides not to leave one. So that's a pretty big challenge. Another challenge on the next slide can be training. So in more than 60% of phone calls, a discussion about an appointment is never requested or talked about. This tries to take all of the product or service calls and says how often a customer volunteers to come in, how often a service rep offers, and how often it's sort of never mentioned. And so this is just intended to say that, like in the digital world, we can do all we can to improve the online shopping cart. In the mobile world, we've got to focus a lot on the offline shopping cart, and sales training and practices are one of the biggest areas of opportunity. The last couple of slides I have before handing it off to John Loschke, just talk a little bit about the types of consumers that actually click to call. So this is something that people often find surprising. We took about 50,000 phone calls to auto dealers, and then using third-party data from Neustar, we modeled those consumers by age group. We actually do it over a bunch of different demographic traits, but I'm focusing on age group here. And the bottom three, basically people from 18 all the way up to 44, are much more predisposed to using click-to-call compared to the average U.S. consumer than uh, than the older age groups. And I think this is really interesting in that there's a bit of a misconception about phone calls sort of being something that is a little bit old school. But actually, as Mike was saying, there's maybe a biological predisposition to actually connecting about something, asking some questions, establishing that human connection. And as it turns out, our millennial friends are also interested in a human connection. So with that, I'll just say one more thing before handing off to John. It's on my last slide. There we go. Is that what successful marketers are doing is taking all of this data by channel, the number of phone calls, how successful these phone calls are, how much it costs to purchase all of these phone calls or purchases the advertisements behind these phone calls. What are my opportunities at the call center, at the dealer itself to improve operations? And they're using those things to optimize advertising budgets. And I couldn't think of a better example of that than CDK Global. So rather than me wax poetic about this, I think I'd like to turn it over to John and have him tell his story.
Great, appreciate it, John. Again, my name is John Loschke. I'm the Director of Multi-Screen Strategies, or I should say Multi-Screen Platforms at CDK. What does that mean? It effectively means that I'm responsible for ensuring meaningful and quality consumer experiences across all of our screens, whether it be desktop, tablet, or mobile. For those of you that don't know a lot about CDK, we've been around for roughly 40 years providing DMS and digital marketing solutions. We have 26,000 dealers worldwide that are using either our DMS platform or our digital marketing platform. Last year, we had roughly $2 billion in revenue, and as of today, we have 7 of the largest 10 dealer groups in the U.S. So we're really excited and really proud about a lot of those accomplishments. Just want to say quickly, I appreciate the opportunity that Mike and John have both given me to just talk a little bit about our relationship with Marchex and talk a little bit about how multi-screen design influences click-to-call activity. Next slide. So today we've got a really strong relationship with Marchex. Certainly the integration is even stronger. We have tens of thousands of dealers today that are using the Marchex solution across a variety of advertising tactics, and most importantly, generating millions of phone calls annually. And for our dealers, it's really ultimately about understanding, attribution and gathering more insights as they build and invest in advertising programs. Next slide. So I want to spend just a little bit of time kind of talking about our multi-screen strategy a little bit and how it influences click-to-call activity. So today at CDK, we're certainly at an inflection point or intersection point in that over the course of 15 months, we've gone from roughly 25% mobile penetration on our dealer websites to over 50% mobile penetration today. And we ask not only our own associates but our dealers and our partners, what are we doing to align ourselves, with these trends, and what must we consider as we try to create meaningful experiences and drive call activity. And so it really fundamentally is built around 4 principles of our multi-screen strategy, and that's content and the type of content that we present. Having smart and strategic content is really important in delivering not only the message for a particular dealership and making, establishing awareness of their brand, but also highlighting the details of a vehicle. Certainly we evaluate data and performance on our network as we try to influence these experiences and optimize the consumer journey through these websites. We certainly evaluate the devices that are rendering and displaying these dealer websites. We have to take into account the capabilities of the device. Things are evolving very quickly. People are now heavily focused on wearables, and it's important that we as a company understand what those trends are and how we can accommodate those trends as we build and design these experiences. And then last but not least, I just want to talk a little bit about design, because fundamentally design, in our opinion, is the biggest influencer in consumer experiences. It certainly is the biggest driver in establishing a positive brand perception. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the fundamentals of our design philosophy in the next slide. So the design philosophy is really built around these kind of 5 fundamental principles, and they're really simple. And it's interesting to note that quite often people think that just adding more content to a site or a page is important, and that's what consumers really want. But ultimately, it's about really understanding, why you're creating something, trying to define what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Simplifying the design is a real important part of this. What we're trying to do now with our own designs is reduce the clutter and really focus on a design that delivers the message for a brand, delivers the message as part of an advertising program. That's really, really important, and strong design generally lends itself to shorter, more concise statements. And you see that in a lot of things today. Simply go up to apple.com and you'll see how simple their design is, and yet it conveys a lot of information that speaks to emotions and desires. And then really it's about trying to understand what the user requires and how does your design solve for those. And then as we look to the consumer experience, it really is about delighting them. It's creating authentic experience and moments, things that consumers will remember and want to come back to. And that's important as consumers are trying to establish, or I should say dealers are trying to establish strong relationships with consumers. They want to delight them, and that's certainly part of those long-term relationships about that revolve around selling vehicles and servicing those vehicles. And then last but not least, it's about just being innovative, and that's certainly a large part of what we do with Marchex and several other partners that create these experiences. Next slide. So as these design principles drive more authentic experiences, it ultimately drives consumers to the dealerships. Generally, these obviously being initiated with a phone call, as Mike alluded to earlier. As you can see here, our designs extend across the spectrum of large displays to laptops to tablets and to phones. Next slide. So as we rolled out these new designs over our dealerships over the past year and a half, we've seen a dramatic shift in behavior in terms of how consumers engage with these sites, what they do on these sites. And a lot of it is again, based on very simple, clean design principles with an emphasis on call to action. And here's a really good example of where, we've highlighted the click-to-call buttons on a website. Traditionally, these are green on all of our designs, and there's a reason for that, and that's generally because most of the native call functions for a device are generally green. And the results have been pretty dramatic, and I've got a couple slides in which we can kind of go over some of those metrics. So there's a couple things here. As we look at our vehicle search result pages as well as our vehicle detail pages, we've gone to larger images, larger buttons, a flat-based design, which is very much in line with what you see in Google and Apple and in Microsoft-owned properties. And ultimately, we saw significant lifts in our click-to-call activities across not only sales and service, but other departments as well, whether it's parts and service or collision or body shop, etc. We saw a significant increase in inventory search events. Interestingly enough, and you look at this and you see a down arrow for vehicle detail views, it's because we've actually provided more information. We've been more strategic in the type of content that we present earlier on in that car shopping journey, that we actually gave consumers the ability to make those critical decisions earlier on in the car shopping journey. And ultimately, we saw an increase in email leads as well. But most importantly, and this is the next slide, we saw significant increases in click-to-call activity. And again, it's simply about highlighting key call to actions. And for sales across roughly 9,000 dealerships, we saw almost a 90% increase in click-to-call activity for the sales departments, as well as a 40% increase in click-to-call for service. And all of this, again, was driven primarily through design enhancements. So we're really excited about this. We continue to evaluate, as I said earlier, we look at a lot of data. And we'll continue to apply these design principles throughout the consumer experience on our websites. Ultimately, the goal is to drive consumers to the dealerships, and again, that all starts with generally a phone call. So I appreciate it. Back to you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, John. I love the design-centric angle and making sure that the proper calls to action, in this case click-to-call buttons, are predominantly placed, and you clearly are seeing positive results from doing that. And thanks also to John Busby for a lot of good insights. So we're going to go now to questions, and I'll remind the audience to write your questions into the questions section of the GoToMeeting dashboard, and we'll do our best to get to all the questions. So there are a few that have come in here already, and I have a few of my own too, so let's get right into these. First question is for you, John Busby, and John Loschke, you can feel free to weigh in as well if you like. But people are clicking or click to call from Google and Bing and search engines. Where else is there volume for phone calls to auto dealers, in your estimation?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. Would love John Loschke's thoughts too. Before I answer that though, I just want to give the slide little crop there. John Loschke, would you like to give your contact information for people to reach out?
I'll get that before the end of it.
Okay. Yeah. All right. We'll do that at the end. Okay. So outside of search engines, I think that people are evaluating what auto dealer to call from a bunch of different places. I know that I recently used review sites like Yelp to understand what the buying experience was like before going in and purchasing my last vehicle. And so even though Google and Bing get a really significant amount of the search mind share due to their volume of queries, directory and business lookup sites, all their queries are about businesses. And so when you add up the hundreds of publishers where people can get advice or search for businesses, including auto dealers, you can see that non-search channels are really, really interesting. I'm also, Mike, like you, fascinated by the rise of calls from social. And although they're not intent-based, I think we're moving to a paradigm where brand ads allow you to connect at the spur of the moment directly with a place of business if you're interested. And since a lot of the time that we spend on our social, sort of our social apps are killing time, a phone call can be a way to get something off our plate or to learn more about a product or service we're interested in purchasing. So that's my answer.
I think all I would add is that there's certainly a lot of emphasis on driving traffic to dealerships from Tier 2 sites, which are essentially regional marketing groups. All of you have heard of Northwest Ford dealerships, Southern California Chevy dealerships. All of those groups are driving traffic to those Tier 2 sites with the intent of distributing the traffic out to the local dealerships. So we certainly see call volume coming from those mid-tier mobile sites and websites.
And I'll add to that too that in a mobile-based world, it's becoming more and more app-centric. So Nielsen has reported that 4 out of 5 minutes spent with mobile are done in-app as opposed to mobile web. And in-app, as we all know, isn't where kind of search is the front door. It's already in these siloed buckets of functionality, to your point, John Busby, with things such as directory sites or even in this case apps. So I fully agree with that. Now, one kind of follow-on question to that, the overall concept of where calls are coming from. One hot topic in the marketing world is attribution. So what are the ways that you can attribute phone calls, not just to the place where the call was launched, like, for example, a landing page, but in some cases the upstream sources of influence that may have channeled that interest, such as perhaps a search campaign? And what are you doing with respect to these kind of attribution challenges and tying that back to the right campaign or keyword in the case of a landing page call?
Sure. Yeah, let's dive deep on search since you brought that up. Google's made significant investments in click-to-call sort of options for advertisers to drive phone calls. Obviously, phone calls can occur from from landing pages or web pages, but they also occur within the ads themselves. And Google allows marketers to have call-only ads, where the only call to action is a phone call, or ones that either have a call to action, which is a call, or a click to link to a mobile landing page. And I'm talking obviously about mobile in this case. The challenge for marketers is that for all of these types of calls, you really need data back to the keyword in order to optimize, kind of like what you would do if you were in e-commerce. And then you also need a really good sense for the outcome of each call. Not just was it long or was it short, but was it a sales or service call? Was there a long conversation or a short conversation? These types of things are all clues to the marketer about which specific keywords are actually driving sales and value. So those are the challenges. I can tell you that earlier this year we released a solution for this called MarchX Call Analytics for Search, and what it does is it provides it attributes 100% of calls, no matter where they're made, from search to the keyword level. And then we also have really deep integrations with major bid management platforms and these integrations are automatically synchronized. So the new call data shows up directly in these software packages for marketers to do the types of optimizations they need to do. Although folks with homegrown solutions too can also use this data from us.
Nice. And as part of that, you mentioned the kind of call quality. It's not just duration; it's other kind of things that your Call DNA platform is kind of picking out. And earlier you talked about some of that conversational data that's really helping things like employee training, even, such as the fact that they weren't asking for appointments enough. And I think that's really important because it's a vital lesson in illustrating how this entire discussion isn't just about driving calls, but also in optimizing sales and operations once those calls come in. So I'm curious, what are some other ways that your data has potentially uncovered previously unknown issues that were impacting sales? Like, for example, you mentioned that hang-ups can be a killer in terms of lowering conversion rates, and that's kind of tied to the hold time. So what are the kind of some of the things that your data uncovers in terms of actionable tactics for auto dealers to, for example, lower their hold times, and how are they going about doing that?
Well, one way that we approach this, because most clients, whether it's auto or really any vertical that receives calls at the local level, have the same set of challenges. Am I selling well? Am I answering the phones? So the way that I like to approach it as an analyst is compare the best and worst stores or individual locations. Because once you can find some locations that always answer the phone and turn most of the people that call into appointments, or at least leave them with a really good experience, I provide the blueprint to the marketer on how to approach the individual locations and help make them better, at least formulate a plan. I think if mobile's doing anything, it's breaking down silos. It used to be there was an e-commerce team that kind of handled the website, and then there was an offline team that handled things at the stores. But mobile's blurring these things together and also giving opportunities for entire organizations to be transformed in a really positive way.
Excellent. John L., any thoughts about how the dealers you're working with are kind of evolving their operations based on some of this stuff?
I don't think they're so much evolving their operations necessarily, but certainly, as they look at, the various profit centers, they're trying to drive more business to those profit centers. It was interesting looking at a slide that you had, John, earlier about the call destination. Something that a lot of people don't know is that more than 50% of a dealership's profit comes from parts and service. And so as we look to kind of build out these experiences on mobile, it certainly, behooves us to do whatever we can to allow these dealers to drive more phone calls and traffic to those businesses and profit centers within the dealership.
That's interesting because that probably has a lot of impact for their kind of search marketing strategies and the keywords they're bidding on in the ad groups and things like that. So the results of those in the call seem to be able to kind of feed back into those strategies, as John mentioned earlier. So very interesting. I have another question here. How does an auto dealer deal with spam calls or robocalls?
This is John Busby speaking. I thought that I could find nothing more infuriating than email spam, but I think we have one with robocalls. I'm sure everybody's starting to receive more and more of those direct on their mobile phones, and it's happening to all types of businesses. We look at this problem sort of on a macro level, and imagine that with telephone charges of call to 800 numbers, and also the lost productivity of answering these types of calls, it costs businesses around the United States more than $1 billion. It's a really, really big deal because it's so cheap and easy to blast out 50,000 robocalls. And anyway, there are a couple things that dealers can do about this. One is since so many of these robocalls are kind of clumsy, by that they mean they don't press 1 or 2 on an IVR. They're just kind of automated messages. Having an IVR, thank you for calling such and such, press 1, press 2, can mitigate some of the impact, although that's not always the experience I imagine that a dealer wants. I think as part of our platform, we offer enterprise-level spam protection. So we take we take the millions of inbound phone calls that we receive each day and diagnose each one to know if it's a spam or a robocaller, and if we believe it is, we block it. And we actually made a pretty big update to this technology earlier this year to identify these types of calls, even when the caller ID is faked or spoofed, which is one of the ways that these spammers have gotten through. So anyway, I guess it's a long way of saying it's a big deal, and we're investing a lot of time and energy into making sure it doesn't impact our customers.
That's great, and I see a larger impact as more of these calls are happening. I've studied the fact recently that due to do not call legislation, a lot of solicitors and those that are sending out robocalls are instead resorting to calling businesses because they're kind of forbidden from calling individuals and cell phones and things like that. So it seems like that problem and the problem you're solving is even growing as we speak. So we are almost at the top of the hour, and in these webcasts, we like to give people some turnaround time to their next meeting or whatever they're doing in the next hour. So I'd like to kind of finish things off first with a question for you guys. For the audience members who haven't yet adopted click-to-call campaigns but are joining us today because they're curious, what are the first steps, kind of notes of practicality, that they can do today or tomorrow to begin to get the ball rolling? What would you recommend?
Well, I would recommend starting to measure phone calls from a single very important channel. I often think search is a great start, since there are so many phone calls that are happening from search, and obviously a lot of budget from marketers tends to be spent on search. So I would say solve for paid search with a call analytics solution, and you'll probably prove to your organization that it's necessary enterprise-wide. So that's my short answer to the question.
Nice. John L., any parting thoughts?
That's really John's domain, so I defer to him. That sounds like a good response.
Great. Well, that's great. So thank you so much, both of you. Very insightful stuff. Thank you to the audience for listening. And at this point, I will pass it back to Georgina for some closing notes and housekeeping. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Again, as this slide reads, we will have this available for viewing on demand. And as soon as we have that available, we will email everybody with the link. Thank you again for taking time to join us this afternoon. Thank you, John, and Mike. And this webinar is now concluded. Thank you and have a great day.